All right. And we are back for yet another episode of the Media Show. Today, we have a special guest. We have a beltway guest, Beth. We're in the thought leadership world. I love that. You know, this is my dream. I was never hired by a Thought Leader magazine. Just for the record, my entire career, I think I had it calculated once. I had interviewed at 6 different kind of Thought Leader magazines and 0 for 6. So a dummy like me had to stay in golf and travel. That was that was my destiny. But we are joined today, Professor Egan, by Chris Grimm. Chris, you're the CEO of the RXN Group. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Look at that. So we did some homework here. We have the CEO of the RXN Group. We're thrilled to have you. We have probably a wide-ranging potential conversation here. I will, as many know, all of my aforementioned brothers and family, they are all used to the conversations about Google Antitrust. We've had some historians on talking about presidential media. We had the founder of the co-founder of Complex. We've talked about the kind of the gestation, if you will, of video and the internet and stuff like that. So we're a wide-ranging place to go for media. So we're really interested in getting a handle on the world of. Am I saying this properly, Chris? Or are you a policy wonk? Am I talking to our first official policy wonk?
So
that would be really exciting for me.
I tell people I'm a policy nerd by birth and a political hack by training.
I love it.
No, I finally got there. This is where I needed to be. Okay, so Beth, you take it away here, and I'm gonna jump in as needed.
Yeah, Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. We started this really with the idea of, just wanting to talk about all things media. Craig and I, with our backgrounds, we're sort of agency, publisher. And, given our embarrassment of riches, it's kind of turned into a Google conversation because it's the gift that keeps on giving. So, I think that's kind of how I'll open. We've been talking a lot about the Google ad tech case. The two sides came out this week with their remedies, which I'm fascinated by. We'll definitely talk about that. But we've got the search case, the RTB case. There's news breaking on that as well. So Google just, is getting battered from all sides. Would love to hear from you. I guess, a couple questions. What do you think is the most important case, if there is one? What do you think is Google's biggest risk at this point? And, we were talking earlier about the fact that so few people are really talking about this, and why not? Because it's probably going to be the biggest thing since the breakup of AT&T.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting time. I also tell people, in addition to being a policy nerd and political hack, I'm not a lawyer. I just play one in real life. So my sort of perspective and my work on this issue is more from the policy standpoint than a legal standpoint. But we seem to be at a really interesting inflection point in antitrust law right now, given the rise of large digital platforms like Google, like Amazon, like Apple, like Microsoft, right? Like, it is so different from 100 years ago, right? In school, we all learned about the breakup of US Steel and Standard Oil. Yeah. These were really big companies that became vertically and horizontally integrated to control 90+% of a market and raised prices on consumers, right? The price of gasoline went up significantly as Standard Oil gained market share, and so the government stepped in. We live in a world where the products and offerings that these large platforms are offering to consumers are free or incredibly inexpensive. And it's such an interesting, like I said, inflection point of trying to apply our current antitrust framework that's very focused on consumer harm, right? Like, what is the harm to consumers? What is happening in the marketplace that is forcing prices up and innovation and service to go down. And you can't get any cheaper than free. And the pace of innovation is continuing to sort of be mind-boggling, especially as we stand on the precipice of AI. And a lot of these conversations may be moot in 5 years, given how AI is touching so many different aspects of technology. Yeah. On your question on what's sort of the most impactful, I think the search case is the one that's got the most sort of impact for everyone in the digital ecosystem, right? Like,
and it's probably the one that they're under the most threat as well, right? With the rise of ChatGPT. It's an interesting time because I think when this started, nobody was talking about AI. And so in between the time that case starts, I remember it very clearly, it was January 23.
Yep.
When everybody was like, have you tried ChatGPT? I was like, yeah, I know about it, but I was involved with a startup at the time that was in AI, and here we are now where, I just picked up my 20-year-old from college, and he recounted an entire story where a student that he knows very well, is scoring incredible grades, and he chalked it up to AI, ChatGPT.
Yeah. I think the search case, a couple interesting points here. The search case, I think, is the most profound because Google's synonymous with search, right? Mm-hmm. Kleenex is synonymous with tissues, Jell-O with gelatin, Google with search. And so changing how that fundamentally works and the way in which we all search for information is happening in the marketplace, right? Like ChatGPT, OpenAI, other sort of large language model, AI accessibility has completely changed the way that people search and interact with information. Google already had changed that, right? Like the way that they had built their search browser, their search engine, completely made the modern internet possible, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And you've got a case now that the decision in, and not to go too deep into the weeds on the legal side of it, but like you had the first part of the case, which is, did Google do anything wrong? Right. Mm-hmm. And the judge found Google violated, law with these commercial agreements with Apple and other device manufacturers to make Google the default search engine. Right?
Yeah.
If you've ever tried to change the search engine on your device, it's actually super easy. It's easier than trying to change your default web browser on a Windows PC, but that's a whole other issue. And so that was what they found was sort of the conduct that's illegal. The Department of Justice came back and said, okay, to stop Google from doing content like this in the future, you've got to sell off your Chrome web browser. And in 5 years, if you don't do these, certain things, you're going to have to sell off your Android operating system as well. It's called structural relief, right? When you're changing the structure of a company. That seems wildly out of scope for the conduct that was found to be, anti-competitive and violating the law, right? Which was the payments to these manufacturers to be the default search engine.
Does antitrust, Chris, is it because they're looking at the future? Is it future proofing at some, and is that part of what antitrust can do? I mean, with Microsoft, it seemed like there was a little bit of that as well in the famous Microsoft case, but I'm not familiar with that actually being something that they're supposed to do.
It's not because you can't, right? Like the core of the Microsoft case is, as far as I know, was around Netscape, right?
Yeah,
like
that's right.
Microsoft's
bundling.
They're bundling. The requirement that you take Internet Explorer in order to get Windows was tremendously disadvantageous to Netscape, which I don't know if anyone remembers Netscape, but it's impossible to look in the future and see what the market's going to be. Mm-hmm. MySpace was called a monopolist. Mm-hmm. God, I'm dating myself. 20 years ago, right? And where's MySpace now? The tech market is so volatile in some ways. I don't know if that's the right word, but the innovation that happens, like I remember being in college and going back and forth between MySpace and Facebook based on who changed their user interface. And it was like, no, I don't like the MySpace one anymore. I'm going to Facebook. They changed it. I'm going back to MySpace. All of these choices exist in ways that they never did before, right? the idea of divesting Chrome and divesting Android are probably the biggest remedy that's been suggested out there in many of these antitrust cases, because that's now like, these are not singular products that operate in a vacuum, right? All the large platforms are so valuable to consumers, to small businesses, to big businesses, because they're integrated products and services, right? Chrome doesn't exist in a vacuum. It interacts with other parts of Google. Search interacts with other parts of Google. Tools like Google Business Profile integrate search with reviews, with maps, things that are fantastic for businesses that are just trying to get in front of people in their neighborhood, and for people to see, oh, you know, Beth's Diner is open late tonight. They're around the corner and they've got, 5-star reviews. Great, I'm going, right? That's got value in integrating those products and services. When you start to break apart any of those integrated products, you're degrading the value to the people who use that, the business that use that as a marketing tool, and the consumers that rely on that to find who's open at 11 o'clock in Syracuse.
So my counter to that, Chris, is on the innovation front. What would somebody at, and I don't know if people remember this, because this actually isn't that long ago, but it's long enough ago that people might forget. But we'll start with like Foursquare and Gowalla, I believe, a few of those. And then, of course, now the only one still fighting Google in that space, in my estimation, is really Yelp. Like, shouldn't Yelp be the service there? Should Yelp be a third party that Google has to pay? And, in other words, like the innovation, I get it. I mean, our first podcast, just so where this conversation starts, was about is 2003, 2004 Gmail, right? And the idea that, we were doing the math. I mean, Google came in and just swamped me. I was on AOL. I was on AOL. My friends were here or there, and we all wanted a Google account, right? Because it was free. It had unlimited, at that point, what seemed to be like unlimited storage and blah, blah, blah. But that's the first stepping stone. And then, again, talking about the other antitrust cases going on at the same time, the ad tech side of it, we can get into that. But stopping at search, like you just mentioned, there are all those features kind of all working together. Google, I think the idea is Google elbowed the competition out and said, we're going to keep this all in-house. And maybe not for sinister reasons initially, but if we brought somebody on from Yelp, what would they say?
Can I just jump in there real quick before you answer, Chris? Because you mentioned small business, Chris. And, I was having coffee with the guy who runs the Stanley Steamer business here in Central New York. So classic small businessman. And he looked at me and he said, if you're looking for somebody to come clean your carpets, are you going to Google or are you going to Yelp? I need to know, because I need to know if I need to spend the time and the money to boost my Yelp reviews. And I'm like, nope. Now, Yelp's not elbowed out because Google is a monopoly. Yelp is elbowed out because Google does it better.
Yeah. Well, and it does different things better as well, right? If you're looking for quick information, right? I'm Googling Stanley Steamer, right?
Yep.
I'm looking for a specific business.
Yep.
Getting that Google business profile with the reviews at the upper right corner is incredibly valuable to that business because it's directing me directly to their site. I can see their hours and it's free for that business, right? We talked earlier about price, right? Free is a price and it's a hard price to beat. It's free for the consumer as well. On Yelp, right? And you as the business, you have the ability to, moderate reviews if things look like they're, made up or AI generated or whatever. Like you can work with Google to get things removed. You can change your hours, right? Like you have access to that in a way that you don't on the free version of Yelp, right? And so there's a barrier to getting the most out of Yelp if you're a business. There's also value in traffic, right? Europe passed the Digital Markets Act a few years ago, which a lot of the cases here and proposed policies in the US are trying to follow the Europe.
Yeah, they're right.
And they're different standards, right? In Europe, we've got to protect competitors.
Mm-hmm.
In the US, our approach has always been we've got to protect consumers.
Right.
And so free, valuable information versus paid for potentially equal or less valuable information, that raises the question, like, who's actually being harmed here?
Mm-hmm.
And so under the Digital Markets Act, web traffic to aggregators like Yelp, like other booking sites, has gone up significantly at the expense of small businesses, right? As soon as the DMA went into effect, there was concern from like small hotel operators saying our web traffic has dropped by 30% and our bookings by 20% because they're losing that direct traffic because everyone's getting shuffled through aggregators like Yelp and other sites. That's got an important impact. It's great for Yelp. And look, Yelp would say, no, we're being treated unfairly. We can't compete with Google because Google has whatever percent of the search market. They're always going to be able to preference their products. I understand that that's your perspective. You're a business trying to compete with Yelp.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking. Yeah,
what's best for the businesses that are behind those reviews and those pages, and best for the end consumer.
Right. I mean, Yelp is an interesting one to look at, but you mentioned a whole kind of plethora of technology wrapped up into one that for the small business owner is crucial, right? Maps. I work with, I consulted with a well-known automotive chain for a while that had a beep beep in their ad creative, and those guys. I mean, I don't think of the maybe 40 I dealt with, they were really only interested in Google, right? It was a Google only conversation for a reason. Catastrophic auto repair, you're probably stuck in the car, right? You're on the roadside, you're in a car, somewhere between New York and DC, you're looking where you can get the car fixed. So I think that there's a place for that. I think what the argument is, of course, is Yelp or, I don't remember the name. Boy, this is really embarrassing. I know Foursquare was one of them, and I can't remember the name of the company that I used to steal their internet in my startup office. They were around the corner from me in the Village. It's crazy. And those guys would probably say, well, we should have been invited to the table. They should never gotten in that business, in the comment review business. But I understand why Google does it. Again, this is where, Chris, this is the conundrum of the whole thing is Beth and I and I'm just going to throw this out there. I was old enough to see Star Wars in the movie theater. So I'm definitely older than you. And I don't know if, I'm prematurely gray, but you have a beautiful dark head of hair and a beautiful beard. I do not anymore. So I will tell you, I will tell you this is, I often blame my own industry, right? So I look at magazine publishers and publishers in general, and they kind of seeded, initially they were like, well, these people at Yahoo, everybody's talking about Yahoo. Let's work with Yahoo. And I was at Meredith Corporation when Yahoo came in, and we started calculating that. I was telling this story to Beth, like, I don't think publishers knew how to calculate a CPM, below $30. And when you're telling them to calculate a CPM in cents and in single dollar bills, they were like, I don't understand. How could it be so little? And Yahoo was quaint compared to what happens, of course, when DFP is purchased or when, algorithms change or the newsfeed changes inside of Facebook or whatever, like 2014 and 2017, the newsfeed in Facebook changes twice, and it completely detunes publishers, and 60% of our audience was gone. It's this type of stuff that, is unplannable, and I think is the issue at heart. So when we're talking about Yelp, I'm using that as an example, but you could probably talk about any number of map companies that wanted to compete with Google in the map space or wherever, right?
I challenge anyone to come up with a good experience, and I'm not throwing individual companies under the bus here with MapQuest back in the day, right? Look, there's competition goes both ways, right?
Mhm.
If you have a captive audience and you can build a better product for that audience than other people, and better is oftentimes subjective, right? Convenience is a significant part of better, right? We talk a lot about, like, I have 7 different first rules of communications, right? The first rule of communications is reach people where they are, right? If you're able to deliver a product to people where they are, and if a lot of people are using Google search, and that creates the ability to serve them with different products or create different packages and business lines because you have a captive audience, right? That would be like criticizing that would be like saying the Washington Nationals have a monopoly on advertising within National Stadium. They have a captive audience, right? People are going to the stadium to watch the Nationals. The National says, you know what? We can increase our revenue by selling ads on the outfield wall in that stadium.
Yeah.
They have a monopoly on
Yeah.
advertising in that stadium, right? The people who are spending money to advertise there are doing it because there's value, right?
Yeah.
And the Nationals built that value, not so much the last few years, but they
Yeah.
built that value by building a great ballpark, right?
I didn't even know you guys had a team, to be honest. I'm not familiar with the name.
The World Series a few years ago.
It's vague. It's vague. Anyway, I think where I was going is, and this is the sympathetic side to Google, right? Is you have to drive the innovation, right? And somebody has to maintain. Beth and I have talked about the remedies in these cases being the divestiture of Chrome, and then on the ad tech side, it's like, they're going to have to yank DFP out. But who now is in the position to take over these businesses and keep them innovated, right? To the point where they're doing the job that they're supposed to be doing, right? This is the conundrum that goes back to when the New York subway system was, it was turned into a public trust, right? Is like, oh boy, it goes from a private product, multiple companies running multiple rail lines, to a public product that everybody wants like you mentioned earlier, in the case of just, the generic individual going on to do a Google search, it's free, right? It's free. So what could be better than free? Well, a really inexpensive subway ride on the New York subway system. The New York subway system gets compared to other subway systems around the world, but I will dare anybody to go and check the price of the London Tube, or taking a ride in Hong Kong versus taking a ride in Tokyo. The price difference is enormous. The New York subway system is an unbelievable value, but we all know the condition of it is not great. And I'm not sure people, again, to your point, a stadium in the National League, right? All the advertising, forget that. A subway system in America's largest city doesn't matter as much as the Chrome browser on this device, right? Or the Android operating system on this device, or the OS system on this one, right? So that's where the problem is if we break them up, who's picking up the ball? Is it another? My problem with the ad tech side of this is who's picking up the ball.
Yeah, I'd like to if we could back up, and I want the answer to that question. But I wanted to ask you earlier. I have not spent as much time reading the actual rulings and remedies of the search cases I have with the ad tech case. Can you help connect the dots for me on how did Meta get from monopoly in search to divest Chrome? Can you connect those dots?
You mean Google?
No, the judge, Meta.
Oh, God, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. I know when I said it, I realized that was going to be confusing.
I was like, wait a second. And that's DOJ's proposal, right? The judge is still sort of hearing what's right. So they just wrapped up. Each side presented their arguments on the remedies phase. Closing arguments will be about a month away. To distill the DOJ's position, it is Google's power is such that unless you force these divestitures, they're going to do it again, right? Like, that's essentially to just break it down, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but to just break it down into very, very simple points is they've done this. They've abused, right, to use the DOJ's terminology here, they've abused their monopoly power to foreclose on competition. Simply saying you can't enter into these agreements again is not going to be enough to prevent future bad behavior. So we've got to force divestiture. By the way, just before I forget, used to ride the NW train from Astoria every day to 59th Street and then the 405 all the way downtown. That was a good time being
the never and rarely.
Never and rarely, and then the 4-5. Wow, that's a classic IRT. Who knows what's going on that line? It's an interesting. It's really interesting stuff. I mean, I don't know what it boggles the mind to think of, Google. I don't know how you yank Chrome out. In my mind, I can't pick it up in my own head.
And Craig, to your question before about who picks that up and continues to drive it and drive innovation the way Google has been, this goes back to that discussion of, are we protecting competitors or are we protecting consumers and the end users, right? If you force, in both of these cases, if you force Google to divest Chrome, other search engines and web browsers will benefit, right? That's I don't know if that's definitive, but I can extrapolate that if you do that, there's going to be benefit for someone else, and they may be able to innovate more than they currently are, but you're still losing all of Google's resources and data and integration and experience and technology that's been driving innovation at a fantastic rate for the last couple decades. On the ad side as well, again, very similar kind of structures in play here, right? Google had captive audiences. They pulled together a few different companies to build something that connected advertisers and publishers better, faster, cheaper, right? If you force AdX and the other acronym, DFP, DFS? DFP, let's say some other company picks them up. Let's say News Corp, right? They're one of the chief critics of Google's ad tech. Let's say News Corp picks it up. Are they going to be able to invest and innovate and bring the same?
That's the question.
Yeah. Right. So News Corp will benefit by that, but will all the publishers who work with Google technology, all the advertisers who do, right? Again, the idea that someone pulled together a better product and delivers value better, faster, cheaper than someone else is wrong simply because it's big or simply because they can charge a premium, right? The root of the ad tech trial goes back to changes Google made about, price floors across different exchanges, right? The idea that someone who's providing better, faster, cheaper service can't charge a premium for it is just mind-boggling to me, right? Because part of the argument in that case is, well, once Google made that change, publishers couldn't go anywhere else. They absolutely could, because the whole crux of that case is you couldn't charge different price floors across the different ad marketplaces. So there are different ad marketplaces that publishers could go to. They just weren't providing the same reach, value, etc. that Google was. You also could do that all yourself. Like I've talked to a bunch of publishers who've started blogs and who've said, when I first started doing this blog, I had to do partnerships with all these other companies, right? So she had a recipe blog. She's based in Florida. She's like, I spent all of my time working out deals with Cuisinart and all these other companies to be able to monetize and make money off of my blog. That was certainly still an option for anyone that didn't like Google's rules or the way Google was sort of setting up the market. That is more expensive, more time consuming, right? And more difficult than working with a partner like Google, right? So trying to sell ad space yourself, right?
Right. But Bill, yeah. And we've all, who's ever built a site from scratch, initially you're not even eligible to work with with Google, right? So you have to go out and you got to find other services to land your advertising. I think the more important point, and you raised two things as a publisher I look at. Number one, the publishers, when this first happened, right, were caught completely, I think, without any alternative in their mind, right? There was nobody else who could keep the dollars flowing. Publishing is a margin business, and I don't need to get into the margins, but it's not like it was in the 19th century, where you were making 90% margins. It has been whittled away to that point where we were really arguing with the U.S. Postal Service about postal rates, right? It was eating into margins. Print, ink were eating into margins, right? All that stuff. Subscription revenue had just tumbled from the 1970s to the 90s, right? Where, you could get 12 issues of a magazine delivered to your house for $9, right? That didn't cover the publishing, printing, and postage, right? So the advertising became paramount. So when they get into digital, and I'll turn this into a digital history lesson on a very embarrassing side of the industry, I think that when I mentioned earlier that they were enamored with Yahoo, they're consumers too. The guys, the heads of these publishing companies are old school for the most part. They were not digital pioneers, and DFP was a known entity at that point. The problem with DFP going to News Corp is, it's not even the fact that they couldn't afford to keep innovating. It's what publisher wants to do all of their publishing with News Corp, right? Like, they have competition. The Dotdash Meredith is not going to be like, oh, sure, yeah, let's do this, or whoever owns CNN at this point. I just don't know. So I think that's really my question on that one. But there is a line that, I don't know. I mean, call me old school, but like they own the end to end, Chris, right? Like they own both, my end of it, and then Professor Egan's end of it, the advertising side of it. They own those relationships, and those relationships with the ad agencies are a little bit wonky, to be honest. I don't know what really was going on there. There's a lot of testimony, a lot of hearsay about what was going on there. And on my side of it is, we were being inundated not only with Google, but at that point, social media, right? I think we had a conversation on this very program with Rich Antonello, where I said, I was running all of Muscle and Fitness digitally, and there was a singular, muscle guy blogger who came out of nowhere and had double our social media following, and all the advertisers were like, hey, we're just going to work with that guy. So like it came at them in so many ways. I think in search, this is my opinion on search. The search side of it should have been remedied 10 years ago. Because that's when it was still possible to, I think, remedy it. I don't think yanking Chrome away and Android and the operating system makes any sense at this juncture. Maybe 10 years ago, that would have been a better idea. The advertising side of it, I wonder if it's just a tweak or two to the way that the transparency is run that changes everything there. To me, in my layman's, like I'm not a layman. I'm in the business, but I look at it and I say, is that the tweak? Because quite frankly, if they're torn out of it, does Trade Desk just replicate what Google does here?
Yeah. So a few things, and you're definitely know more about the ins and outs of the tubes on the advertising, side of it than I do. But from a policy standpoint, 10 years ago, I don't remember when Google's agreements with Apple and other device manufacturers to be the default search engine went into effect, but
it's about then,
right? That's the thing that the court found problematic in that case, right? And I think, look, divestiture is a radical remedy in all cases, right? Because you're talking about structural changes to companies, right? So the bar to do that should be really, really high, right? The bar to break apart companies should be beyond a reasonable doubt that doing this is going to benefit consumers, end users, etc. Right? In the ad case, I agree with you. I think the idea of breaking apart these tools now is going to have some unintended consequences that may not make the market better for consumers and end users. And I think in both cases, what is the conduct that is deemed to be illegal, and what's the appropriate remedy to narrowly address that conduct, right? Even in Microsoft, right? Internet Explorer didn't end up getting spun off from Microsoft, right? From Windows, and now it's called Edge, right? Through appeals, right? It was divestiture was sort of, overturned. The last real divestiture was AT&T, right? Where it was, breaking up the bells, and now we have 2 phone companies, right? And 4 cell phone companies, right? And so,
well, you have a lot of innovation though in between. I mean, at one point, there was Singular, there were all these other brands, right? And then they've been consolidated, but there was a lot of innovation that has to be, but by breaking up AT&T, we got a lot of innovation, I think. I mean, I don't know. I've only really kind of touched on it once in one book that I read, that it kind of said, yeah, sure, it's come back around. You're right. There's, I think, 2 or 3 landline phone companies on the planet at this point, but there's still a lot of cell phone innovation that wouldn't have happened, I don't think.
I think that's right. But again, it was very clear that AT&T at the time was harming consumers by their market size and their market power.
Yeah.
And so the way to break that, right, the way to provide relief to people who were getting charged astronomical rates for long distance was to sort of break up the company at the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think here we're saying is like, who are the individuals who are being harmed, and is breakup the appropriate way to sort of provide relief to those harms? And I think what we're both saying is it's certainly not cut and dry.
No.
And maybe even no, right? And what you mentioned before about when we were talking about the changes to the price floors and all, if that's the behavior that's problematic, right? If you're sort of price fixing in a way that's hurting publishers, right? Look at that behavior, right? Mm-hmm. If you're looking at agreements about making search the default browser, and what great innovations have consumers been robbed of by having to use search instead of Bing or DuckDuckGo or whatever, right? Okay, let's address that behavior, right? But when you start getting into these companies are big is bad, they've got to be broken up, you're ignoring the efficiencies, the scale, the affordability that comes with a company that can integrate all these things. Craig, you mentioned earlier, they own both sides of the market. That makes it easier to connect the advertiser with the publisher, right? Like there are benefits there. There is
no doubt
that goes in.
No doubt that is right. That is correct.
So
right?
I have this theory on what the DOJ is asking for in both cases, really. I come from the media planning side of the business. So I would walk into a client meeting recommending how they should invest their advertising dollars. And we always had this great plan that we loved, that we knew they were never going to buy. We had this crappy plan that they couldn't buy because it was crappy. And then we would come in the middle with the one that we were hoping they would zero in on. So I have this theory that the DOJ is doing something similar in these cases, with coming in with these remedies that are so far out there, like you've been talking about, like such structural changes that, do we even have the authority to do that? From the perspective of, if we get half of that, we'll be happy. You're down in DC. Am I in the ballpark?
You're describing the art of the deal, aren't you?
First class ticket to Mar-a-Lago immediately to negotiate this. Let's go.
If it was a settlement negotiation, I would agree with you, right? Because you never start with your best offer, right? In any negotiation, you never start with your best offer. But there's there's a real threat, and you're kind of playing with fire a little bit to say, we're going to throw out the most radical remedy that we can. If you get two courts to agree with you, right? If you get district court and a circuit court to agree with you, that's it. That's now policy, right? Like there's no more stays after that. And so it's a dangerous game, because I don't think it's a negotiation. Again, if it was a settlement, if it was Google and the DOJ saying, all right, let's work this out. What do you guys need to feel comfortable with how we run our business going forward? That might certainly be the case. And maybe this is also part of that. I don't know. I'm again, not a lawyer. I've never been in an antitrust negotiation, but from a policy standpoint, right? Like that makes me really, really nervous, because then that becomes precedent. And what happens if, not to bring in another case, but, Epic Games, starts to grow and starts to sell, VR and AR, headset and technology. And now they've got their own store and that's taken off. And everyone's like, Google who? Right. And now we may be back with a precedent saying, if you're of a certain size and you do certain things, you need to be broken up. Talk about sort of handicapping innovation, right? You're essentially putting a cap on how big companies can get, how much they can invest in next generation technology. I don't think that's good for anyone.
I think that's the fear. That it really, I think, summarizes the fear for anybody who really thinks about this and puts their thinking cap on. I mean, sure. I mean, in my mind, sure, DFP needs to continue to be innovated and built upon. But the real thing is what's next, right? And are we going to fall behind Europe or Asia or somewhere else, parts unknown? Who knows? Could be happening in Greenland. And the idea basically is would we be hamstringing ourselves, not just the small business owner of the local transmission shop? I'm talking about across the board, right? Like this is the nature of these antitrust cases. It's why they're really big. And what Beth brought up at the beginning, like I'm surprised that this is not getting more national coverage outside of media. Like if you want to have fun, go ahead and read all of the posts for all the people on LinkedIn who are in my business and who were the captains of these technologies of real-time bidding. And they're all in this, right? It's touching a little bit, like I'm seeing it a little bit listed, like an MSNBC article might pop up for a half a second, but nobody's really paying attention to this. Is this because antitrust cases are just kind of not in the lexicon? Like, I mean, I only know a few. You've mentioned a few of them. How many of them are there? And what is what is going on? Why is this not talked about?
It's so funny how your bubble defines your reality, because I see it everywhere all the time. Right. And so Washington Post, Axios, Politico, right, like all of the publications are covering this in pretty significant detail, right? And so inside the Beltway, again, your bubble defines your reality, and so in my world, I see it all day, every day. To average people, to the small business that's trying to get their transmission shop in front of people whose car broke down, they don't care how the tubes interconnect. They just care that they can find people for a good price and that it works. It is a deeply esoteric term, right? Even the terminology used, antitrust, right? Remedies, right? Like these are terms that your average person, don't understand.
These weren't featured on Law and Order.
Yeah. And what most people know about it is what they maybe learned in school about Standard Oil and Teddy Roosevelt, the trust buster and all.
Yeah.
The other innovation point that I kind of want to bring up, because I heard this from a small advertiser not too long ago. They didn't advertise on TV for a long time because the metrics were terrible, right? Like your impressions for who you needed to reach and what you needed to do didn't fit with what they were getting from online. They recently started advertising on local TV because now the metrics are catching up, right? There's not just innovation in technology and in the tubes that connect advertisers and publishers, the advancements on the metric side, right? Beth, I'm sure you remember what when you were advertising for Coca-Cola, right?
Yep.
And when you were managing TV buys and you were looking at the ratings and the demos for different TV shows and where do you want to place and in what hour block, the metrics you got there versus what the smallest advertiser on any online platform can get now is infinitely more granular and more useful and more actionable than what was out there 20 years ago.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring that up. So I've written a media planning textbook, and we were putting together a simulation model. And the whole simulation model was built around, did you buy what you bought, the media that you bought, did it deliver sales? So ROAS, return on ad spend, was our metric. And we were like 2 weeks out from launch on the simulation model. And my publisher went out and did a focus group. And they came back and they're like, no, we got to change it. Media people aren't held accountable to return on ad spend. They're only held accountable to impressions. And I looked at the publisher and I said, was anyone in that focus group under the age of 40? And they looked at me and they were like, no, why? I'm like, because that is old school media planning thinking. Yeah. Today, to your point, yes, the metrics are there, the measurements there, and that's what we're looking at. And I'm glad you brought that up because, we're talking about how people aren't talking about these cases. Whenever these issues of data privacy arise, the measurement piece never gets talked about. And that is going to be a huge impact on this system if we break it up.
Yeah. Look, the ability to, through data collection, processing, and metrics, whether you're a very, very small business or a very, very big business, right? Small business doesn't necessarily mean small data.
Right.
You could be a small app publisher. You could be a small, seller on Amazon and have data on 300,000, individuals. The ability to process data and add value and know your audience and know your demographic and know if you're that app or you're that seller, that your product does really, really well with a certain segment of the population and that you can go to multiple different platforms, right? That's the other piece that we didn't talk about in terms of competition. There's social media, there's display, there's search, there's in-app advertising from iOS, Apple, there's in-game advertising on games on PlayStation, and right, like you guys know all this better than I do. There are more options now to reach your target audience than ever before. And the competition between all of these companies to tell me, the advertiser, we're the best person to reach your audience is insane, right? It's never been like this before.
Yeah.
Yep. I mean, that is a great way to look at it. The only issue in that model, right, on the not so much on the search side, although publishers are affected by search as well, is on the publishing side. We are, we're at the mercy mostly of this kind of non-transparent system, and they don't have enough people, right? I mean, sales organizations at even the biggest publisher at this point, online and otherwise, cannot cover off on all the potential accounts that they might have, and nor would they be able to handle, if somebody said, I could spend $500 on your product, they have minimums, right? Because they don't want to have the time to set up a $500 campaign in a system. Not everything is self-serve. So I think that's where this kind of the issue, and you mentioned, the Politicos of the world, and I, obviously I'm in on that one. I'm in on Semaphore. I'm in on, Vox, and even they, right, struggle with this, right, with bringing in enough dollars to keep their product, let's say, free, as opposed to setting up a subscriber wall, right? Is that where this is? So I think the going back to the initial phase of this, and I don't blame Google. I'm not here to blame Google. What I'm saying is the confluence of events. The U.S. government said, here, thumbs up, go ahead and buy, DFP, in 2008, and everything else happens in 2010 and 2011. And by the time they're done, they have the end-to-end solution that is making it possible, all being fair to everybody, making it possible for advertising to work in many ways. But there were some innovation attacks. You got to be very fair, right? Like they made sure that there were cases where the header bidding and other things were kept kind of, we're not going to do that, and they had the control, right? Having Dart in place, right, and making everything convenient, where it's like, hey, everything's in one platform, one reporting structure, one place to go. That means you only have to have one person working there instead of 6, right, who understand all 6 platforms separately and whatever else. So I understand the convenience side of it. I just think that the publishers are on their knees at this point. The open web is decreasing and decreasing and decreasing in total spend. You see the spend going to social networks, to these walled gardens and these places where it's all contained in one location. And we were, again, Beth and I were just doing another podcast, a similar topic. The idea that, I can't share the Wall Street Journal article to my 10 friends who I want them to read the Wall Street because they're not subscribed. That's part of the problem. Is once we hit subscription model, what's going to happen to all of that capability? Are we going to become a dumber place? Or are we already dumbing down? I mean, I saw somebody said somebody made a study. We were at the height of our intelligence in 2010, and I think it's because there is no pass along anymore. You're not able to, I can't send an article to my son up at school in the New York Times because he doesn't have a subscription. It's only good for 2 people.
I don't know, Craig. I think we've proven that more information doesn't make us smarter.
Yeah, but I think filtered, and you want that one article. You know what I mean? That one article that can be the game changer, right? We've lost that. We've lost that ability. We used to say, Beth and I lived in a world where, the average, Time magazine, People magazine weekly was bigger rating than the biggest episode of Seinfeld. I mean, that was a well-known thing. Like, where do you get that today? The flattening of media has just been out. It's been too quick, I think, is ultimately the point.
I mean, there's so many things to unpack there, Craig, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you go back far enough and all newspapers were subscription based. Right? Because you got a physical thing delivered to your house. And if you wanted to share it, you had to physically walk it over to someone and go, hey, did you see this article in today's paper or in last week's magazine edition?
I was a 1980s paper boy.
Me too. You gotta put the Saturday coupons in the
Oh, nothing worse.
And so there was, and look, this is outside of my area of expertise, but as a consumer of media for most of my life, you had subscription-based physical product delivery, right, that lagged when the internet started to become a thing, right? Yeah. Like you mentioned before about publishers being sort of old school. I'm not there. I'm not in the business. I don't know what the choices were or what things looked like 15 years ago 20 years ago when people stopped consuming news in a physical delivered paper and started consuming them on screens. But that happened. That was an innovation that just happened in society. Publishers might not have been quick enough on the uptake on that, right? And the sort of example you gave about I can't share a Wall Street Journal article, with my kid. You can print a PDF of it, which is the equivalent of taking your, physical copy and
that's
walking
true.
it over.
And I've done that. That's how I do it. That's right.
And so, but you brought up another point about sort of social media and those walled gardens. Is it incumbent on the social media platforms to say the way that our technology and innovation and the way society is evolving is not good for this person over there? I've got to go take care of them? or is it incumbent on the people who innovation and technology are outpacing to figure out how to adapt and change and grow, right? No one said, oh, what are we going to do for the poor buggy makers when, cars came along, right? There's a great picture. I think Neil deGrasse Tyson talked about this. New York City, 1895, horses everywhere. Yep. New York City, 1903 or 1910 or whatever the time frame was, no horses anywhere.
Yeah.
Did anyone say, what about the buggy makers?
Yeah, I get it. I'm there. I mean, it's the subway. It's all of this kind of wrapped into this. It's innovation. I think that's what we're really, the heart of the conversation is, are we going to stunt innovation or have we stunted innovation is really the question. And I think the idea is the future proofing of it to make sure that everybody, Microsoft is the closest. I know AT&T is a big breakup, but Microsoft is really the closest thing to what we're really talking about here. And then, of course, the Meta case, which is beginning to simmer, and everything else. Like, it's all kind of coming together because these things they're monoliths. I mean, there was an article circulated maybe in 2017 where all of the media spending digitally was 92 or 90. I can't remember the number. I'll have to reach out to my friend Charlie who knows this. Like 94% of the media budget was being spent in 7 businesses. I mean, I don't know. That sounds a lot more like Standard Oil than it sounds like anything. Like my business, my small digital publishing network was fighting Google. It was like, I used to describe my business people as a pimple on a pimple, on the ass of Google. Like I wasn't even competing with them.
Standard Oil was one company.
Yeah. Right? I mean, this is 7 companies dominating, I don't know what the total size of the business was. Yeah.
Craig, that's not because these 7 companies are monopolies. And Chris, you're right, it's one company. So we're kind of talking apples to oranges. Those are client-led decisions.
Yeah.
There's a client I work with right now. I won't mention them because I don't have permission from them to mention them.
Right.
But they very specifically, very consciously work with 5 partners. And sure, Google is one of them. But they do that because they can't afford to work with 10 partners. They need to reach their audiences as effectively and efficiently as they can. And, so breaking this up is not going to help them in any way.
I'm torn. I'm absolutely torn. We're also tearing into over an hour here. We're at 57 or 8 minure
Well, let's give Chris the last word.
Yeah, Chris, you're going to take the last word, but we're going to have to bring you back. Obviously, this was great. You're absolutely fantastic. Great guest.
Thank you. Thank you.
Look, please close us out. Yeah.
There are different levels of competition too, right? At the highest macro level, those 7, and it's probably more than 7, right? Like those 7 may be the biggest, but those companies, right? The big platforms are competing fiercely with one another. Right. For every advertising dollar. Right. Because I jokingly say the most valuable real estate in the world are these right here.
Mm-hmm.
Right? People's eyeballs. Right. Yep. And reaching them and breaking through delivers real value to the ecosystem. There's competition amongst all the people that they serve. Right. So Beth, the example you just used of a small business, they can't afford to run Super Bowl ads. Right. They can't afford to run the type of mass media marketing campaigns that much larger companies can.
Let's be fair. The company that I'm referencing is a Fortune 500 company with $100 million budgets.
But it's the same thing at scale, though, right?
Yeah, that's right.
More, right? They're competing with their competitors. These platforms are enabling companies large and small throughout the digital ecosystem to compete.
Mm-hmm.
They're not right? You as a publisher, Craig, you were not competing with Google. Google was a service provider, right? That enabled you to compete with other platforms and other publishers, right? Like other service providers, you may not have been happy with the service or the price or any other thing that you might get into with any service provider, subcontractor, vendor, whatever.
Yeah.
But the competition that exists now, right? 30 years ago, that transmission repair shop, you had 3 choices on where to advertise. You had your local paper, your local radio station, and your local TV and billboards, right? And 2 of them were cost prohibitive, right? You couldn't afford to run on TV. You couldn't afford to run on radio. So you grabbed a billboard, where you could, and you ran in the local penny saver, whenever you could afford to. Now you can advertise. You could spend $5 a week advertising and get your business in front of people. You can compete. You can be out there and you can compete. You could be a small restaurant and compete with national chains, by having good metrics and good advertising. We talked a lot about harms and competition and markets, right?
Yeah.
The judges in both these cases have a really important decision to make, and it's one that I'm glad that I don't have to make, is what's best for the most amount of people, right?
Yeah.
What's going to drive the most utility for the most people, right? We know that Google search, Google's ad businesses work really, really well for the most part, right? The things that don't work well, let's make sure they change them. What we don't know is if you force them to split up, if you force search, if you force Chrome out of Google, if you force, AdX and the other tools out of Google, no one knows how well that's going to work or what that's going to look like.
Yeah. Well, that was great. I really would love to continue. This was fantastic, Chris. And, we love having somebody in the Beltway. Or at least I do. I think it's great.
An insider.
Yeah. An insider. And I'm already brewing in my mind how we can have our big media show Beltway event. We can have Chris duke it out with, some reporters. It would be really fantastic. But yeah, this was really fantastic. I want to thank you for taking a full hour of your afternoon on a Friday to yammer with a dummy like me and a professor like this one over here. This has been a lot of fun and very informative. And I think it really does, it really is a major, it's a major problem. I'm very torn. I mean, and I know, I know enough to be dangerous and I'm torn. I can't imagine, like you said, like my friends who own a transmission shop today, the only thing that they're going to notice is if it's gone, is that, if it's broken up and they lose 30% of their business, they're going to be furious. Right.
Yeah.
5%.
All right. Yeah. Right. Well, yeah, even right. 5%. But I could see things, I know Beth is hyper aware and really involved in the small business aspect of this. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. Is that going to be the end of the local pet supply store who's competing with Chewy and everybody else, right? PetSmart and everybody else, because now he's really going to be off the board. So I think that's, and those are future conversations. Let's book time now after we get the remedies and bring you back and get some Monday morning quarterbacking. Love to have you.
Happy to do it. Love to talk.
All right.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.